right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Coffee and Hardtack, the Civil War Museum's bi-weekly digital program where we talk to Civil War historians and educators. I'm Jenn Edginton. I'm Curator of Education at the Kenosha Museum campus, and with me is Doug Dammann, who's also from the Kenosha Museum campus, and he is Manager of the Education Department and Curator of the Civil War Museum. We're really excited for our special guests today. We have Stephanie Arduini from the American Civil War Museum. So thank you so much for being with us today, Steph.
Thanks for having me.
And so first things first, tell us more about yourself.
Sure. So I am the Deputy Director and the Director of the Edward L. Ayers Center for Civil War and Emancipation Studies at the American Civil War Museum in Richmond and Appomattox, Virginia, which that's a huge title, but basically it means I oversee our education staff as well as our collections team and our exhibits team. So all of the storytelling efforts that we do as a museum and crafting that voice and what kind of impact we want our storytelling to have.
Great.
Stephanie, your museum recently celebrated its first anniversary at a kind of a new site at the old Tredegar Ironworks in Richmond. Can you tell us about that renovation project, the new building, and the narrative that your museum focuses on there in Richmond?
Absolutely. So I'm going to do the educator thing and rewind what seems like an absurd amount, but I promise it'll make sense. So the Tredegar Ironworks, where we are in Richmond, was opened in the 1830s, and it became one of the largest ironworks in the entire country. It was the largest ironworks in the South and supplied over half the cannons that the Confederacy used during the Civil War. And in the early 2000s, or the mid-2000s, they opened a museum there called the American Civil War Center, which was a kind of groundbreaking organization that was trying to tell the story of the American Civil War from multiple perspectives. Also in Richmond, I'll say, since the 1890s, the Museum of the Confederacy was another institution that also interpreted the Civil War, and especially about the Confederacy. Initially, it ended up being more of a shrine for the Confederacy as it emerged out of the kind of that same period that the Lost Cause was really bustling. But by the mid-20th century, it had become a more scholarly institution, really exploring the American Civil War from a Southern perspective and in the South. So in 2013, those two museums decided to merge and create a new organization called the American Civil War Museum, which is where we are today, and with the goal of telling the Civil War from multiple perspectives, but using this incredible collection of the Museum of the Confederacy, which had been acquired from the Civil War veterans, many of them Civil War veterans and their immediate family members themselves. So it's an astounding collection that now we get to really use and tell the story of the Civil War in lots of different ways. A year ago, we opened our new flagship operations at Tredegar. And this was a big deal for us because it gave us the opportunity to think about what kind of stories we wanted to tell about the American Civil War in the 21st century. So we're telling the story not just from here's the Northern perspective, here's the Southern perspective, or here's the Union perspective and the Confederate perspective, and here's African Americans, and over there in the corner you'll find stories about the home front. We really wanted to tell a story of the Civil War, all integrated throughout, because that's how life happens. It wasn't as segmented in history as we sometimes organize it in museums, because sometimes you organize things in a way to help it be clear. And the Civil War in particular is a really messy, complicated topic. But for our exhibit, we wanted to embrace that complexity. And we really wanted to make sure that we were integrating the stories of women, of children, of other civilians on the home front, of politics, of African Americans making emancipation happen in and among and throughout with the rest of the military story, because you can't separate either of them in the history itself. So we didn't try to separate it in the exhibit. And we wanted people to make it feel like the story was alive with complicated humans in a way that makes them reflect on the choices they're making today. If it's the idea that this story really mattered more than we often give it credit for, or the way that the Civil War and its legacies are still shaping our lives today. We wanted that feeling of inspiration and almost a call to action to come out of that exhibit, and therefore also all of the other programs and projects and temporary exhibits that we do.
Great.
That was a long answer, but I think I got back to the original.
Yeah,
That was great.
comprehensive, but you got it.
Yeah, and kind of based on your answer, and you're right, the Civil War can be such a messy time for students of history to understand, really, right? So how have the narrative changes that have happened with this new exhibit and these new opportunities, how have they helped the visitors, guests, students understand the Civil War better?
So one of the things our founding CEO really wanted to talk, or she said a lot, our founding CEO was Christy Coleman, who is now at the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation. But she wanted people to find the familiar faces, their icons, their idols, and also discover something new. So if you're interested in this over here, cool, you'll find that. You're also going to find this other story over here that you might not have known. So trying to understand what people were bringing with them and what they were interested in, and challenging that by introducing something new. So that's been really exciting to see how that works. So for example, my dad is a huge Civil War buff. He dragged us to all sorts of battlefields growing up, and I blame him for the job that I have, and he loves it. But he, I think what was interesting is when he came to see the museum, he's a guy who loves military history and loves reading about biographies of military leaders. He knows all of the regiments and where they were stationed at such and such battlefield, and can talk about their flanking maneuvers and their strategies. That is not my wheelhouse at all. I'm much more interested in a different part of the story. But even as we included military things and other things, he found enough of that military content to geek out at the sword that Louis Armistead had as he crossed the stone wall at Gettysburg, or other kinds of really crazy cool artifacts that we have, and came out of that just so excited to explore new ideas and new angles of the history that he had just never even thought about. It's not that he wasn't interested or was avoiding it, he just didn't connect them or wasn't exposed to it in a way that helped him connect the thing he was passionate about with something else. It was a crucial part of the history. So I'm glad to see that lots of folks, no matter what place they start from, come out of that exhibit finding something else that they want to know more about. Even people who are just totally agnostic about the Civil War, and they're being dragged along by their family member who wanted to come geek out at artifacts, they come out of it really interested, and then often really pensive and just processing, which is good because it's a heavy topic and we want people to feel the weight of it. But it's been impactful, and we've seen a wide variety of people connect to new stories and new ideas.
Great.
Within that light, do you have a personal favorite exhibit, albeit either in the permanent gallery or the temporary gallery, that you either helped develop or that you've seen reactions with your visitors that it really struck you, and that, you know, that's your personal favorite, that's your go-to when people come to visit the museum, that's what you're most proud of?
It changes. Changes depending on my mood and the day or whatever is going on. Yeah, it's really interesting. There are a few artifacts that I love to talk about and will spend too much time talking about if I'm touring people through the galleries.
It's such a museum educator answer.
Right? It's terrible.
They're all my favorite. How do you pick?
Well, so there are stories that I think are really interesting because it complicates the stories of the Civil War that I had initially encountered when I was going to school, but are different now. So, for example, Richmond, Virginia was the capital of the Confederacy. And in every news story you read about Richmond, it's always Richmond, Virginia, comma, former capital of the Confederacy. Like it's apologizing or contextualizing something. And then it goes on and talks about whatever it is. But I think what's interesting is that people often think about folks who were supporting one side or the other in the Civil War as being 100% based on their geography, but it's more complicated than that. And here in Richmond, there was a story of a woman named Elizabeth Van Loo, who was a wealthy white woman here in town who was a strong unionist. She and her family were strong unionists. They didn't support secession. They were really supportive of the idea of keeping the United States together and thinking about a strong national government. She and her family, especially her mother, were also strong abolitionists, which those don't always connect. And that's something coming from Michigan originally we didn't really talk about, the idea that you could be a unionist and an abolitionist or only one or the other. But she was a unionist and an abolitionist. And when we designed our exhibit, we apparently had in our collection china belonging to the Van Loo family. And she was amazing because instead of just holding on to those abolitionist and unionist sentiments, she chose to act on them. And she established a union spy ring here in Richmond and actively gathered intelligence for the United States government and military. And after the war, in recognition of that service, Ulysses S. Grant eventually made her postmaster, which was a pretty awesome station at that point. But her memory was obscured and kind of bastardized as her life went on, as being somebody who was vocally against the Confederacy in the post-war South, especially kind of moving into Jim Crow and Lost Cause South. Her memory was kind of turned into like Crazy Bet, like the crazy old lady, as opposed to somebody who had conviction and acted on that in a way that was really effective. And then turns out we had some of her plates. And that's cool as a way to think we actually had artifacts from her, because so many, like her house was torn down and a school was built there. It was not seen as worth preserving for a long time.
That's fascinating. And I think artifacts just tell so many important stories that who would have thought that that came out of a plate, right?
Right.
That's really great. I have kind of the last question. If Doug, you don't have any more, right?
I have lots, but we're time constraints.
Fair enough.
So I know, because I've gotten a lot of recommendations from you. We went to a museum gift shop together, and I think that was one of the worst decisions we both made because I bought too much. But do you have any recommendations for anyone who wants to just learn more? So think just Civil War or the era, doesn't have to be military history. What should they read, listen to, watch? You know, what would you say?
Okay, I'll try to keep my recommendations to a minimum. I have small children, so I think a lot about children's books about the era. We have a list on our blog at acwm.org with kids' books that we really like that talk about the Civil War era and slavery. So if you're interested and have small children, it's great. And I think about this way too much, and I'm happy to give you feedback. If you have small children in your house or in your life and are trying to think about how you talk about war and death and slavery and all of these things together. In terms of other things, one of my favorite go-tos to recommend to visitors coming out of the exhibit are two books written by Edward Ayers, who is our founding board member and continues to be a good friend to the museum. But he wrote one of the most interesting and accessible kind of overviews of the Civil War, I think, because it blends military and social and political things all together, iconic individuals and totally unknown individuals. And so his books are called In the Presence of Mine Enemies and The Thin Light of Freedom. And it follows two towns, one in Pennsylvania and one in Virginia, that are very similar in geography and way of life, of size, in economy. Just the one real different variable is one allows slavery and one does not. And so many of people who come into those communities or are members of those communities and kind of radiate out onto battles, it's such a personal and complicated and well-written pair of books that I think it can get a lot of people into the story and help it make a lot more sense. And then the other thing that I've been listening to a lot lately, I recommend this one to teachers. It's two different podcast series. Through North Carolina Public Radio. It's a program called Scene on Radio, SCENE on Radio. And they did a great series on whiteness. So since so much of the Civil War has to deal with race and power that relates to that, their Scene on White series is fantastic as a way to understand the history of race and slavery in our country. And it extends way back before the Civil War, but some of the first few episodes look at the origins of race as a construct and how that weaves into the founding of our country. And I think it's really important to listen to. And they're doing a new series about just a look at American history, but from perspectives of power and inequality in ways that not a lot of people sometimes get from the textbooks that they get in school. And there's some great episodes there, one on the cotton economy that shows just how powerful cotton was in our country. And the cotton growing states in the Confederacy, those states represented the 6th largest economy in the entire world. So if you're thinking about why are these southern states seceding, and there's that larger narrative that we have in our pop culture about, well, they were just doomed to lose from the beginning. They were incredibly powerful, and there was a lot at stake in keeping that cotton economy and the institution of slavery going. And those series bring in so many wonderful historians and do such a great job at storytelling. They're fantastic. So I recommend, I don't remember the name of their second series, but it's by Seeing on Radio. And I think it's maybe a Langston Hughes quote that they pull their title from, but it's really good.
Great. Well, thank you, Stephanie, so much. This was really informative and really fun. It's always great to talk to you. So thank you so much. And thanks for everyone for listening. We'll see you next time.